Welcome to the He Music channel, Stories of Slavery. Today's story follows two enslaved twin sisters who escaped music into the Wild West and, breaking every law of their era, became the most lethal bounty hunters the frontier had ever seen. Chorch music. Chorch, their names were erased from the records. Their faces never appeared in a single photograph, but the men who hunted them never forgot. And the men they hunted, He music, never survived long enough to warn the others. This is a brutal and intense journey through violence, music, sisterhood, survival, and transformation. Pause for a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city and country you are listening from. Your participation, music, helps keep these stories alive, not forgotten. Let us begin. In the autumn of 1874, two women rode into the mining town of Black Hollow, Arizona Territory. Music, they arrived from the south, from the direction of the Dragoon Mountains. Just before sunset, when the light turned the desert the color of dried blood, they were dressed music identically, long dark coats reaching past their knees, wide-brimmed hats pulled low over their faces, leather gloves, boots crusted with the red dust of 100 hard riding miles. Each carried a rifle across her saddle and two revolvers on her hips. Each rode as if born in the saddle. They were black. They were women. They were twins. And in the saddlebag of the sister on the left, carefully folded between layers of oiled cloth, was a federal warrant for a man named Cyrus Holloway, wanted alive for murdering a territorial marshal in New Mexico. The bounty was 800, one of the largest in the region. Cyrus Holloway was drinking in the Silver Vein Saloon when the twin sisters walked through the doors. He was surrounded by 6 men, all armed, all loyal, all paid. He had been hiding in Black Hollow for 4 months, believing himself untouchable. 40 seconds later, 3 of his men lay dead on the saloon floor. 2 were bleeding and begging. 1 had fled through the back window. Cyrus Holloway was on his knees, his wrists tied behind his back with a length of braided rawhide. His mouth blood where the butt of a revolver had broken 2 of his teeth. The sister on the left leaned down until her face was inches from his. Her voice was calm, almost quiet. "You're going to walk out of this saloon on your own feet, Mr. Holloway. You're going to ride with us back to Santa Fe. And when they put the rope around your neck, you're going to remember the names of the women who brought you there. Our names are Louisa and Esther Vance. Say them." He said them. He said them all the way to Santa Fe. That night in Black Hollow marked the 17th capture in a career that would eventually total 41. 41 men dragged alive or carried dead across the deserts and canyons of the American Southwest by 2 women the newspapers couldn't agree how to describe. The Arizona papers called them the Vance twins. The Texas papers called them the Black Furies. The Mexican papers, writing in Spanish, simply called them Las Gemelas, the twins, as if no other word was needed. The men who hunted bounties for a living called them something different. They called them the reason they decided to try a new line of work, to understand how Louisa and Esther Vance became the deadliest bounty hunters the frontier had ever seen. We must go back nearly 20 years. We must return to a place called Rosewater Hall on the banks of the Yazoo River in Mississippi. We must go back to the night their mother was taken, because that is where the girls named Louisa and Esther died, and the women who would replace them were born. The year was 1856. The place was a cotton and indigo plantation called Rosewater Hall, owned by a man named Percival Dunmore. Percival Dunmore was what the neighboring planters called a man of taste. He imported French wine. He played the violin badly but loudly. He collected books he never read, lining the walls of his library with leather, bound volumes that existed only to impress visitors. He also owned 147 human beings. Percival Dunmore did not whip his slaves himself. He considered it beneath him. He employed a man named Silas Thorne for that purpose. Thorne was a sinewy, red, bearded Georgian who had drifted west looking for work and had found his calling at Rosewater Hall. He carried a bullwhip tipped with small lead beads, and he believed, as he often said aloud, that a slave who did not bleed at least once a month was a slave who had forgotten who owned him. Louisa and Esther were born on Rosewater Hall in the spring of 1852, identical twins indistinguishable to everyone except their mother. Their mother's name was Harriet. She worked in the laundry house behind the main mansion near the kitchen gardens. She had been a laundress since she was 12 years old. Her hands were permanently cracked from the lye soap. Her back was permanently bent from the wooden wash paddles. But her voice was not bent. Her voice could still rise. Harriet had been born on a plantation in South Carolina and sold to Rosewater Hall when she was 19. She had been married once on that South Carolina plantation to a man named Jubal. When she was sold, Jubal was not sold with her. She never saw him again. She did not know whether the twins were his daughters or the daughters of an overseer who had visited her cabin too many times in her first year at Rosewater. She chose to believe they were Jubal's. She told the girls so every night. "Your father was a strong man," she would whisper in the dark of their cabin, holding them both against her chest. "He could read. Did I ever tell you that? He taught himself by looking at the labels on the feed sacks. He told me once that the day was coming when black folks would read every book in the white man's library, and that day would be the end of the white man's peace. You remember that. Your father said the end of their peace was coming." Louisa and Esther were inseparable from the moment they could walk. They finished each other's sentences. They got sick on the same day and recovered on the same day. They dreamed the same dreams and woke at dawn to tell each other, giggling, that they had met again in the night. Harriet watched them and was terrified. She understood something that mothers of single children did not always grasp. Twins were valuable on the auction block. Twins were a novelty. Twins could be sold together for a premium to wealthy buyers who wanted matched domestic servants, or they could be sold apart for cruelty, to break them and see which one survived the separation. Harriet prayed every night that her daughters would be forgotten, that Percival Dunmore would never notice them, that they would grow up quiet and small and useful in ways that did not attract attention. The girls did not grow up quiet. The girls did not grow up small. By age 6, they were already working. They carried baskets of wet laundry from the wash house to the drying lines. They scrubbed the stone floor of the kitchen on their hands and knees. They shelled peas and snapped beans until their fingertips ached. They ran errands for the house servants, darting between the mansion and the outbuildings like a pair of dark sparrows. And they watched everything. That was the thing the other slaves noticed first. The Vance twins watched. Where other children looked at the ground when a white person passed, Louisa and Esther looked at the white person's hands, the white person's hips, the white person's eyes. They counted the windows in the mansion. They memorized the schedules of the overseers. They knew which house dogs would bark at a stranger and which would sleep through a storm. They did not speak of what they saw, not to anyone but each other. Their first real lesson in what Rosewater Hall actually came when they were 7 years old. A field hand named Moses had tried to run. He had made it nearly 20 miles before the dogs caught him in a cypress swamp. They brought him back tied across the back of a horse, bleeding from where the dogs had torn his legs. Percival Dunmore ordered a demonstration. All slaves, house and field, were gathered in the yard between the mansion and the slave quarters. Silas Thorne stripped Moses and tied him to a wooden frame. He whipped Moses 100 times. The girls stood in the front row, because Harriet was in the front row, and the girls were small enough that Harriet could keep them close. Harriet tried to turn their faces away. Silas Thorne saw her do it. He stopped mid-stroke. "Let them watch," Thorne said. "Let them learn. A slave that don't see what happens to runners is a slave that runs." He made Harriet turn the girls' faces forward. He made them watch every stroke. Moses did not die that day. He died 3 days later from the fever that set into the open wounds. He was buried in the unmarked corner of the plantation where the slave graves went, and no mention of him was ever made again by the white family. But Louisa and Esther remembered. That night, curled together on their straw pallet, they whispered in the dark. One day, Louisa said, "I'm going to kill a man like him." "We," Esther said, "Oh, one day we are going to kill a man like him." They were 7 years old. They meant every word. The thing that set the Vance twins on the path that would eventually take them to Arizona happened when they were 10 years old. It was a Sunday in June of 1862. The war between the North and the South had been raging for over a year, though the slaves of Rosewater Hall only knew about it through fragments of conversation overheard in the mansion. On that Sunday, a visitor came to Rosewater Hall. His name was Colonel Augustus Finch, an officer in the Confederate Army. He had come to discuss purchasing supplies for his regiment, and he had come to look at slaves. The Confederate Army was impressing black labor to dig fortifications and build roads, and Colonel Finch had the authority to requisition workers from the plantations he visited. Percival Dunmore did not want to give up any of his field hands. Field hands were money. Field hands were cotton. Field hands were the engine of Rosewater Hall. So Percival Dunmore offered Colonel Finch a different kind of arrangement. He offered Harriet. Harriet was 34 years old. She was still strong. She was a skilled laundress. And the Colonel's regiment, Dunmore argued, desperately needed skilled laundresses. He would loan Harriet to the Colonel for the duration of the campaign. When the campaign ended, Harriet would return to Rosewater Hall. In exchange, the Colonel would leave Dunmore's field hands alone. Colonel Finch agreed. The twins were told nothing until the morning Harriet was taken. A wagon pulled up outside the laundry house before dawn. Harriet was ordered to gather her belongings. She had almost none. She wrapped a spare dress in a square of cloth and walked out to the wagon. Louisa and Esther followed her barefoot in the clothes they had slept in. "Mama," Esther said. "Mama, where are you going?" Harriet knelt in the red dirt of the yard. She took one of her daughters in each arm. She pulled them close. Her face was calm. Her voice was calm. The twins would remember later that this calm was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. "I have to go with the soldiers for a while," Harriet said. "I will come back. Do you hear me? I will come back. But while I am gone, you two are going to take care of each other. You are not Louisa and you are not Esther. You are Louisa and Esther. One thing, one heart. You do not let anyone tear you apart. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mama," they said together. "Say it. Say your promise. One thing, one heart. And what do you remember?" They remembered everything she had taught them. They chose the thing that mattered most. "The end of their peace is coming," Esther whispered. Harriet kissed them both on the forehead. She climbed into the wagon. The wagon pulled away down the long oak-lined drive, and the twins stood in the dust watching until it disappeared. Harriet did not come back. 6 months later, word reached Rosewater Hall that Colonel Finch's regiment had been caught in a skirmish near Corinth, Mississippi. The camp followers, including the laundresses, had been caught in the crossfire. Some had survived. Some had not. The colonel's adjutant sent a brief note to Percival Dunmore listing the losses. Harriet's name was on the list. Percival Dunmore read the note at breakfast, shrugged, and threw it in the fire. The twins learned their mother was dead from a field hand who had been in the kitchen when Dunmore burned the note. She had seen the name before the paper caught. She came to the laundry house that night and sat with the girls and told them the truth, because she believed they deserved to hear it from someone who loved their mother. The twins did not cry, not that night, not the next day, not for many weeks. What they did was begin to plan. The planning took 4 years. Louisa and Esther understood with a clarity rare in children that escape from Rosewater Hall was not something you attempted. It was something you prepared for. Moses had attempted escape. Moses had died tied to a frame in the yard. Dozens of others had tried over the years. None had succeeded. The swamps were full of snakes and quicksand. The roads were patrolled by patrollers, the mounted slave catchers who earned bounties for every runaway they returned. The dogs could follow a scent for 40 miles. Attempting was not the goal. Succeeding was the goal. They began by gathering knowledge. They listened to every conversation in the mansion, pretending not to understand, pretending to be simple. They learned that the Yazoo River flowed into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi flowed south to a place called New Orleans, where the Union Army had taken control. They learned that the war was going badly for the South. They learned that Union soldiers had been sighted in counties not far from Rosewater Hall, and that some enslaved people who reached Union lines were being declared free. They learned to read. This was dangerous. Teaching a slave to read was a crime in Mississippi, and learning to read was punishable by whipping, by branding, by having a thumb cut off. The twins did not care. Their mother had told them their father had taught himself from feed sack labels. They began with feed sack labels. They graduated to the newspapers that Percival Dunmore left on his veranda. They would sneak onto the porch in the hour before dawn, the only hour when the house was truly silent, and they would sit on the floorboards and spell out the words by the light of the oil lamp Dunmore had forgotten to extinguish. They learned what a general was. They learned what a proclamation was. They learned in January of 1863 what emancipation meant. They learned that emancipation had been proclaimed and that they, technically, were free. They also learned that no one at Rosewater Hall seemed to care. They began to steal. Small things at first: a paring knife from the kitchen, a length of rope from the stable, a flint, a tin cup, a wedge of hard cheese. They hid their thefts in a hollowed-out space beneath a loose board in the laundry house floor. A space no adult had any reason to look. They stole money. Silas Thorne kept a small leather purse on a shelf in the overseer's cabin. He did not count it often. Louisa slipped in on a Tuesday afternoon while Thorne was in the fields and took $3 silver. He never noticed. Over 2 years, they took $21 silver and 47 smaller coins. They stole clothing, trousers, a shirt, a second shirt, 2 pairs of sturdy boots taken from a dead field hand the week before his burial, when no one was yet thinking to inventory his belongings. The twins cut their hair short in secret, hiding the cuttings in the ashes of the laundry fire, because they had decided that when they finally ran, they would run as boys. They stole a gun. This was the hardest theft and the one that took the longest to plan. Silas Thorne owned 3 pistols. Percival Dunmore owned 7. The house servants had access to none of them. The twins watched for 11 months before they found their opportunity. In the summer of 1866, Dunmore's younger brother came to visit. He was a drunkard who had fought in the war and come home broken. He arrived with a worn cap and ball revolver that he set on a side table in the front hallway of the mansion when he went to bed the first night, and never picked up again for the entire 3 weeks of his visit. On the morning he left, he forgot it entirely. The revolver sat on that side table for 2 more days before the house servants noticed. Esther noticed first. Esther took it before anyone else did. No one ever mentioned it again. Percival Dunmore's brother was the kind of man who lost things. His wife wrote a letter a month later asking if he had left a revolver at Rosewater Hall. Dunmore wrote back saying no. The matter was closed. The twins now had a gun. They did not know how to use it. They did not have bullets for it. They had only the weight of it in their hands and the knowledge of what it represented. They kept planning. The war had been over for a year by the summer of 1866. Slavery had been legally abolished by the 13th Amendment, and yet, at Rosewater Hall, almost nothing had changed. Percival Dunmore had gathered his workers in the yard shortly after the war ended and announced that they were now free, but that they could not leave because they owed him for the food he had fed them and the shelter he had provided during the war. The debt, he said, would take several years of labor to work off. Anyone who tried to leave before the debt was paid would be treated as a thief and hunted down as a thief. This was a lie that many Southern plantation owners told in those years. It was the beginning of what would eventually be called sharecropping and debt peonage. A system designed to preserve slavery under a different name. Most of the people at Rosewater Hall did not know the law well enough to argue. Some who did argue were beaten by Silas Thorne, who had kept his job after the war because the work was still the work. A few had tried to leave and had been returned by local sheriffs, who somehow still considered Percival Dunmore's word law. The twins had read the newspapers. They knew Dunmore was lying. They owed him nothing. They had been born his property and had never agreed to any debt. But they also understood that knowing a truth and surviving a truth were 2 different things. They kept planning. The thing that finally forced their hand happened in October of 1866, just after the twins had turned 14. Silas Thorne had begun to notice Esther. He had not noticed her before. To him, the twins had been a single, indistinguishable unit, small and forgettable, a pair of laundry girls who kept out of his way. But Esther, in the months leading to her 14th birthday, had grown. She was tall now. Her mother's cheekbones had appeared in her face. Her hands had grown long and graceful. Silas Thorne began finding reasons to walk past the laundry house in the afternoons. He began speaking to her directly when he passed, instead of addressing the older women as he had before. He began smiling in a way that made the other women in the laundry house go quiet. Louisa saw it first. Louisa always saw things first. She came to Esther one night in their cabin and said, without preamble, "Thorne is going to do something soon. We cannot wait any longer." Esther knew her sister was right. She had felt it herself, a change in the air, a tightening of a rope neither of them had fully understood was around their necks until now. They set the date. 3 nights away. The new moon. The darkest night of the month. They spent those 3 days doing everything normally. They washed the linens. They hung them to dry. They answered, "Yes, Mom," and "Yes, sir," in the voices they always used. They ate the same cornbread and salt pork they ate every night. They said their prayers at the same time they always said them. And on the 3rd night, when the plantation had gone quiet, and the only sound was the whippoorwills in the trees along the river, they took their hidden sack from beneath the laundry house floor, put on their stolen boys' clothing, pushed their short, cropped hair up under stolen hats, and walked out of Rosewater Hall forever. They did not look back. They did not need to. Everything they were leaving behind, they carried with them. The first week was a nightmare. They moved only at night. They slept in the hollows of fallen trees during the day. They ate the cheese and hard biscuits they had stolen. Then they ate the wild muscadine grapes they found in the cane brakes. Then they ate nothing at all for 2 days. They stayed off the roads. The roads belonged to the patrollers, and the patrollers, despite the end of the war, were still active in Mississippi, still hunting black people who traveled without written permission from a white employer. The twins had no such permission. They had only themselves. They crossed the Yazoo River on the 4th night, swimming with their sack held above their heads, their stolen revolver wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the powder dry. The current was strong. Esther nearly drowned. Louisa pulled her out on the far bank by the collar of her stolen shirt, and they lay together in the mud for an hour, breathing, unable to move. "We are not going to die here," Louisa said finally. "I refuse. I refuse too," Esther said. They got up and kept walking. On the 7th night, they came to a small farm set back from the main road. A single light burned in the window. They were starving. They had run out of water 2 days before. They had reached the limit of what 2 14-year-old girls could do on their own strength. They watched the farm for an hour. They saw only one figure move inside, an old woman, black. They took the chance. The old woman's name was Priscilla Hayes. She had been born free in Ohio, had moved south after the war with her husband, a Union Army veteran, to help establish a school for freed people. Her husband had been murdered by night riders 3 months earlier. She had stayed on the farm anyway, because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving felt like letting the night riders win. Priscilla Hayes opened her door to 2 starving girls dressed as boys, saw through the disguise in about 3 seconds, and said, "Get inside before someone sees you." She fed them. She let them sleep in her loft. She asked no questions for 2 full days. On the 3rd day, when they had regained enough strength to speak, she sat them down at her kitchen table and said, "Now, tell me who you are and where you are going." They told her everything. It was the first time they had spoken their real story aloud to anyone besides each other. It took hours. Priscilla Hayes listened without interrupting. When they were finished, she sat for a long moment in silence. Then she said, "You cannot go north. North is where everyone is running. The patrollers are watching every road north. You need to go west." "West," Louisa repeated. "West," Priscilla said. "Past the Mississippi, past Texas if you can manage it. Out to the territories. The territories are lawless in a way that can kill you, but they are also lawless in a way that can save you. There are black folks out there already. Buffalo soldiers, cowboys, folks who went west during the war and never came back. Out there, nobody knows who you were. Out there, you can become who you want to be." "How do we get there?" Esther asked. "You are going to need more than you have," Priscilla said. "You are going to need a real story. You are going to need to learn things you do not know yet, and you are going to need to stay with me for a while. A winter, maybe. I can teach you some of it. The rest you will have to learn on the road." The twins stayed with Priscilla Hayes for 7 months. She taught them to shoot. Her dead husband's Spencer carbine and 2 Colt Army revolvers were still in the house, and she had plenty of powder and ball. She had learned to shoot from her husband, who had been one of the first black men in his Ohio regiment. She was not a great shot, but she was a good teacher, and she taught them the fundamental stance: breath, squeeze, do not pull, reload without looking. She taught them to ride. She had 2 mules and an old cavalry horse her husband had brought home from the war. The twins had never been on a horse in their lives. They fell off 100 times. They got back on 101. She taught them what she knew of the country west of the Mississippi. She drew maps in the dirt with a stick. She named the rivers they would have to cross. She named the towns where a black traveler might find a bed, and the towns where a black traveler would find a rope. She gave them the names of 3 people she knew in Texas and 1 in New Mexico, who might help them if they could reach them. She taught them to pick a lock. This was a strange skill for an old schoolteacher's widow to possess, but Priscilla Hayes had been full of surprises. She taught them never to trust a white lawman, never to trust a black lawman who worked for a white one, and never, under any circumstances, to let themselves be separated when they were in a strange town. "You are twins," she said. "That is your strength and your weakness. Together, you are 2 guns and 2 sets of eyes and 2 minds thinking the same thought. Apart, you are half of what you should be. Stay together. Whatever happens, stay together." On the night before the twins left, Priscilla Hayes gave them her husband's gun belt, the Spencer carbine, both Colt revolvers, the cavalry horse, and 1 of the mules. She refused to take any money for them. "Your mother would have done the same for my children if I had any," she said. "Now go. And when you get where you're going, do something that matters." They rode out at dawn the next morning, heading west. They were 15 years old. They had no idea that the woman who had taken them in would be dead within a year, burned out of her farm by the same night riders who had killed her husband. They had no idea that the gun belt they now wore had been in 3 battles and had killed at least 4 Confederate soldiers. They had no idea that the name Vance, the name their mother had whispered to them as their father's name, was about to be spoken in towns Priscilla Hayes had only sketched in the dirt. They only knew what their mother had told them: one thing, one heart, and the end of their peace is coming. The journey from Mississippi to Texas took the Vance sisters 4 months. They moved slowly because moving slowly was the only way to stay alive. They avoided towns. They avoided main roads. They avoided rivers with bridges because bridges had toll keepers and toll keepers had questions. They crossed the Mississippi River on a ferry run by a drunk Cajun who took their money and asked them nothing. The only kind of ferryman they were willing to pay. They traveled as boys. They had cut their hair shorter before leaving Priscilla's farm, and they wore their stolen trousers and shirts and boots and wide-brimmed hats, and they spoke in low voices when they spoke at all. Most of the time, they did not speak. 2 quiet black boys on a thin horse and a mule heading west with nothing visible to steal were not interesting enough to be worth robbing. That was the idea anyway. It worked most of the time. It did not work in eastern Texas. 3 men on horseback rode up on them one afternoon in the pine woods east of Nacogdoches. The men were white. They were dressed like drifters with the grayish leftover Confederate coats that many ex-soldiers still wore in 1867 because they owned no others. One of them carried a shotgun across his saddle. "Boys," the one with the shotgun said. "Where you 2 heading?" "West," Louisa said. Her voice was as low as she could make it. "West where?" "West Texas. Going to work cattle. Our uncle sent for us." "Your uncle," the man repeated. He smiled. He had black teeth. "And who is your uncle?" "A man named Washington," Esther said. It was the first name that came to her. "He runs cattle near the Brazos." The 3 men looked at each other. The one with the shotgun kept smiling. "Boys," he said slowly, "I don't believe you have an uncle. I believe you are runaways. I believe somebody somewhere back east is missing 2 head of property. And I believe that somebody is going to pay us good money to have you returned." "The war is over," Louisa said. "There is no property anymore. The war is over where you come from, maybe. The war is not over here. And even if it was, there is always somebody willing to pay for a strong back and a young set of hands. Now, you two are going to get off that horse and that mule nice and slow, and you are going to put your hands on top of your heads, and we are going to take a ride. The man with the shotgun had made two mistakes. He had assumed that the twins were boys. He had also assumed that the twins would hesitate. Louisa drew from the saddle. Esther drew from the hip. Both colts came up at the same instant because the twins had been drawing at the same instant since they were 15 years old, since the first time Priscilla Hayes had made them practice it in her barn. The man with the shotgun was dead before he finished his sentence. The second man managed to get his pistol out of its holster before Esther's second shot put him on the ground. The third man spun his horse and tried to run. Louisa shot him out of the saddle at 30 paces. The twins sat on their own animals for a long moment, breathing, their revolvers still in their hands. The pine woods were very quiet. A single crow called from somewhere. They climbed down. They checked the men. All three were dead. They had never killed before. Esther sat down on a log. Her hands were shaking. Louisa sat down next to her and put an arm around her shoulders. They sat that way for a long time. Is this what it is going to be? Esther said finally. I think it is what it has to be, Louisa said. They searched the men. They found 37 in silver and paper. They found a decent Colt Navy revolver, which they kept, and 2 worn-out pistols, which they did not. They found a half-eaten side of bacon. They found a flask of whiskey that neither of them had any interest in drinking. They found, in the pocket of the man with the shotgun, a folded piece of paper. Louisa unfolded it. She read it twice. What is it? Esther said. It is a bounty notice, Louisa said. These men were bounty hunters. She held the paper out. Esther took it. Esther, read it. The notice was for a Mexican man named Rafael Ortega, wanted for cattle theft in Louisiana. The bounty was 100 dead or alive. The twins looked at each other. They made a living doing this, Esther said slowly. They rode around with a piece of paper, and they found men, and they brought them in for money. They tried to do it to us. Yes. But imagine if we were the ones carrying the paper. Imagine if we were the ones deciding who the paper was for. Louisa thought about this for a long moment. She folded the notice carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. We would have to find the right man to teach us, she said. Priscilla said there was a man in New Mexico. She did. She said his name was Obadiah Freeman. She said he rode with the Buffalo Soldiers during the war and left the army after, and that he lived somewhere in the country past the Pecos River. Then that is where we go. They took the 3 dead men's horses. They buried the bodies under a thin layer of pine needles, because they did not have time or tools to bury them properly, and because they did not feel the men deserved better. They rode out of the pine woods with 5 animals instead of 2, and with the dead men's 37, and with a folded bounty notice tucked against Louisa's heart. They were 16 years old. They had just become something new. The man Priscilla Hayes had named lived 300 miles west of the pine woods in a small adobe house on the Pecos River, just south of what the Mexicans called the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains. Finding him took the twins another 2 months. Obadiah Freeman was 51 years old when the Vance sisters rode up to his house on a warm April morning in 1868. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, gone to some softness around the middle, but still imposing. His hair had gone white at the temples. He wore a cavalry issue Spencer carbine on his back and a Remington revolver on his hip, and he had a long scar that ran from the outside of his left eye down into his beard. He had been born free in Philadelphia in 1817, the son of a schoolteacher. He had read law as a young man, but had never practiced because no court in Pennsylvania in 1840 was going to admit a black attorney. He had worked as a printer instead, setting type for an abolitionist newspaper. When the war came, he had enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the first black regiment in the Union Army. He had fought at Fort Wagner. He had survived. Most of his friends had not. After the war, he had drifted west. He had spent 2 years with the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, as a civilian scout and interpreter. He spoke passable Spanish and a little Comanche. He had left the army in 1867 because he had grown tired of white officers who gave stupid orders and blamed black troopers when the orders failed. He had settled on the Pecos because the Pecos was far from everything. He raised a small herd of goats. He grew beans and corn. He read whatever books came into his hands, which was not many. He was not lonely exactly, but he was alone, and he had made his peace with being alone. He watched the twins ride up from 2 miles off. He had seen the dust long before he could make out the figures. By the time they came within hailing distance, he was sitting on his porch with the Spencer across his knees, which was his way of greeting all visitors. They stopped their horses 20 paces from the porch. Louisa raised one hand, palm open. "We are looking for Obadiah Freeman," she called. "You have found him." "Who is doing the looking?" "Priscilla Hayes sent us." Obadiah Freeman went very still. He lowered the carbine slowly to the porch boards and stood up. "Get down off those animals," he said. "Get in here. There is shade and there is water. We will talk." They spent 3 days at Obadiah Freeman's table before they came to the reason for their visit. The first 2 days were about eating. They had been on the trail for 4 months. They were thinner than they had been on Priscilla's farm, and Priscilla had not exactly fattened them up. Obadiah cooked beans and cornbread and goat stew and did not ask a single real question. He let them eat and sleep and sit in the shade of his cottonwoods and recover from the road. On the 3rd evening, after they had finished the dishes, he lit a small fire in the yard, and the 3 of them sat around it, and he said, "No. Why did Priscilla send you to me?" They told him. They told him everything the way they had told Priscilla. Rosewater Hall, Silas Thorne, their mother taken by the colonel and never returned. The planning, the running, Priscilla's farm, the 3 men in the pine woods, the bounty notice folded in Louisa's coat. When they finished, Obadiah Freeman sat for a long time looking into the fire. "And what is it you think you want to do?" he said finally. "We want to do what those men in the woods tried to do to us," Louisa said. "We want to carry paper. We want to bring in men who deserve to be brought in. We want to make a living from it." "And Silas Thorne," Obadiah said. "And the men who took your mother to the army. Are they on this list?" The twins looked at each other. "Yes," Esther said. "I thought so." Obadiah leaned forward and stirred the fire with a stick. "Let me tell you something. I have been a soldier, and I have been a scout, and I have been a lot of things. And I have killed men in several of those roles. What you are talking about is not soldiering. It is not scouting. It is a trade. It has rules. Some of the rules are written down on the warrants you carry. Most of the rules are not written down anywhere. A bounty hunter who does not understand the rules dies young. Do you understand?" "Yes," they said. "Do you know why I am asking?" "Because you are thinking about whether to teach us," Louisa said. Obadiah Freeman smiled. It was a small smile, and it did not last long. "That is exactly right," he said. "I have not taken a student before. I did not ever plan to. But I will tell you something. I have watched 2 girls ride up to my house after 4 months on the road with 5 horses and enough coolness, in them to keep the reins steady when a stranger raises a carbine. I have listened to a story that should have broken both of you, and I have watched neither of you cry in the telling of it. You are already something. The question is what you want to become. Bounty hunters. Esther said, that is what you want to do. I am asking what you want to become. They thought about this for a long time. The fire burned down to coals. We want to become the last thing bad men see, Louisa said finally. Obadiah Freeman looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said, then we will begin tomorrow. The training lasted 3 years. Obadiah Freeman was not Jock in Esperanza. He did not believe in pain as the best teacher. He believed in repetition. He believed that a skill was not a skill until your body could perform it, without your mind having to supervise. He believed that bounty hunting was not about being the fastest or the bravest, but about being the most prepared. The first year, he taught them the country. He rode with them across West Texas and into New Mexico territory and down into the Chihuahuan desert. He showed them the water holes and the dry washes that looked like water holes but were not. He showed them the trails that the Apache used and the trails that the Comanche used and the trails that white men thought were the only trails. He taught them to find a campsite from a day and a half behind the campers. He taught them to read a hoofprint and know whether the horse had been shod in St. Louis or in Santa Fe or in Mexico. He taught them to tell by the way a man rode, whether he was armed, and by the way a man slept whether he expected trouble. The country was the thing, Obadiah said. Every gunfight he had ever been in, he had won because he knew the ground better than the other man. If you knew where the shadows fell at 4 in the afternoon, you knew where to stand. If you knew which way the wind blew in the canyon, you knew which way the sound of your horse would carry. The man who understood the country did not need to be the fastest gun. The man who did not understand the country could be the fastest gun in the world and still die. The second year, he taught them the guns. The twins had arrived as decent shots thanks to Priscilla. Obadiah made them into something more. He had them shoot until their shoulders ached. He had them shoot from horseback at a canter. He had them shoot standing, kneeling, lying on their bellies. He had them shoot left-handed until their left hands were almost as good as their right. He had them practice drawing from a holster, from a saddle scabbard, from beneath a coat. He had them reload in the dark. He had them reload underwater in a shallow stream he dammed up behind his house, because, he said, a day would come when they would need to. He taught them the knife. He taught them the rifle butt and the revolver butt. He taught them how to choke a man silently and how to break a man's knee with a boot. He taught them that the best fight was the fight that did not happen because you had arranged things so that the other man had no options but to surrender. He taught them that the second best fight was the fight that lasted less than 10 seconds. The third year, he taught them the trade. This was the part the twins had not expected. The trade of bounty hunting. Obadiah said, is 90% paperwork and 10% shooting. A bounty hunter who could not read a warrant, could not tell a real warrant from a forged one, could not write a receipt, could not present a captive to a federal marshal in a way that got the marshal to pay the bounty instead of stealing it. That bounty hunter was going to die broke. If he lived. He taught them to read a warrant. He taught them to write a good hand, because their hand marked them as educated, and educated black bounty hunters were less likely to be cheated than bounty hunters who had to sign with an X. He taught them about the territorial courts and the federal courts and the ways they did and did not cooperate. He taught them which marshals were honest and which were not. He told them to always bring in their captives alive, if they could, because a living captive could testify to the marshal that the twins had treated him by the book, and a dead captive could not defend them from charges of murder. He taught them something else on the last night of the 3rd year. They sat around the fire, the 3 of them, the way they had on the first night. The fire was small. The night was cold. The twins were 19 now. They were no longer the girls who had ridden up to the adobe house 3 years before. They were something harder and leaner. Their faces more like their mother's face, their eyes more like Obadiah's eyes. "There is one more thing," Obadiah said, "and it is the most important thing. You are twins. That is your weapon. No one else in this country has what the 2 of you have. No 2 men, no matter how close they are, think the way the 2 of you think. No 2 men draw at the same half second. No 2 men finish each other's sentences. I want you to understand what that means." "We do understand," Louisa said. "No," Obadiah said. "You understand it from the inside. I am telling you how it looks from the outside. When you walk into a room together, a man with his wits about him sees one threat, because that is what his mind is trained to see. He does not see 2 threats operating as one mind. By the time he realizes what he is looking at, he is already dead. That is your advantage. Protect it. Never let anyone separate you. Never ride into a town one at a time. Never sleep where you cannot hear each other breathing. The day someone gets between you is the day you start to lose." "We know," Esther said. "Our mother told us the same thing. One thing, one heart." "Then your mother was wiser than most men I have met," Obadiah said. "Listen to her." He reached behind him and brought out a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside were 2 matching badges. They were not real lawmen's badges. They were something Obadiah had made himself out of sheet silver years before for reasons he had never fully explained. They were shaped like 6 pointed stars. Each had a single word engraved across the center, VNCE. "I do not know when I made these or why," he said. "I think I was lonely. I think I thought maybe I would have children one day, and I wanted something to give them. I never did have children. These have been in this box for 15 years. I want you to have them." The twins took the badges. They did not speak for a long moment. "Wear them on the inside of your coats," Obadiah said. "Not on the outside. You are not lawmen. You are hunters. But you are also sisters. And you carry your family's name. And when you walk into a saloon to collect a man, I want you to know that somebody made something for you once, because he believed you were going to matter." They rode out the next morning. They never saw Obadiah Freeman alive again. He died 5 years later peacefully in the adobe house of what the doctor in the nearest town called simply Old Heart. He left the house and the goats and the cottonwoods to the twins in a will written in his own neat hand, and they buried him on a rise overlooking the Pecos, who kept the house for the rest of their lives as a place to go when the road became too much. But that was later. In the spring of 1871, they were 19 years old, and they had their first warrant folded in the inside pocket of Louisa's coat, and they were riding east along the Pecos River to find a man named Elias Crowder, who had robbed a stage near Las Cruces and killed the driver, and for whom the territorial government was offering 300 dead or alive. They brought him in alive in 11 days. The bounty notice was their first. The man was their first delivered captive. The 300 was the most money either of them had ever held in her hands. They took the money, rode to El Paso, bought new coats and new boots and a second rifle, and rode out again to find the next name. They did not stop for nearly 5 years. The legend of the Vance sisters grew the way all frontier legends grew. It grew in saloons. It grew in sheriff's offices. It grew in newspaper stories that were half wrong and half invented, and that the twins never bothered to correct. In Tucson, they were said to be sisters of a Union general. In El Paso, they were said to be former slaves of a Mexican land baron who had left them half his estate. In Deadwood, where they had never been, they were said to have killed 11 men in a single gunfight. The truth was less dramatic and more impressive. Between 1871 and 1875, Louisa and Esther Vance captured 40 wanted men across 5 territories. 33 were brought in alive. 8 were killed resisting arrest, which in every single case was confirmed by the federal marshal receiving the body. They never lost a captive to an escape. They never took a bounty that was not backed by a legitimate warrant. They never shot a man who had laid down his gun. They never separated from each other. Not for an hour, not for a minute. In 5 years of continuous work, they made enemies. The white bounty hunters of the Southwest were not pleased to find that the most efficient team in the trade was composed of 2 black women who had been slaves 9 years earlier. Some told themselves it could not be true and refused to believe it, even when their own friends brought stories. Some believed it and decided something needed to be done about it. In the summer of 1873, 4 white bounty hunters, led by a man named Jack Coulter, rode into a town called Piedra Blanca in the New Mexico territory looking for the Vance sisters. The twins were in Piedra Blanca to collect a bounty on a horse thief. They had delivered the thief to the town's deputy marshal and were sitting in the cantina eating dinner when Jack Coulter and his men walked in. Coulter did not waste time on conversation. He told the twins to stand up and walk out with him. He said the bounty on the horse thief was his bounty, not theirs, and he was going to collect it, and they were going to leave town. Louisa, who did the talking when Louisa felt like doing the talking, set down her fork. She looked at Jack Coulter for a long moment without answering. Then she said, "Mr. Coulter, we have already delivered the man. The marshal has already paid us. If you have a complaint about who the bounty belonged to, you should take it up with the marshal." "I am not taking anything up with anybody," Coulter said. "I am telling you to give me the money and get out." Esther, who did the watching when Louisa did the talking, had already counted the men. 4, including Coulter. 2 had their hands near their guns. 1 was standing by the door, probably to cut off retreat. The 4th was behind Coulter's left shoulder, clearly the second in command. Esther had also counted the other people in the cantina. 11. 3 women, 8 men. 6 of the men were Mexican laborers who wanted nothing to do with this. 1 was an Anglo drummer in a suit who was edging toward the back room. The last was the bartender, who had a shotgun under the bar and a face that suggested he would use it if things went bad for the twins. And not for Coulter. Esther stood up from her seat on Louisa's left. She did it slowly because slow was less provocative than fast, and because slow let her move her right hand down to the hem of her coat without Coulter noticing. "Mr. Coulter," she said, "you have made a mistake. You are going to walk out of this cantina with your men, and you are going to get on your horses, and you are going to ride south. You are not going to ride north or east or west, because north and east and west are the directions my sister and I travel, and we are not going to share a road with you. Do you understand?" "You do not talk to me?" Coulter said. "I am talking to you. I am going to kill you in about 3 seconds. You are not. My sister is going to kill you. I am going to kill the man behind you. My sister is going to kill the man to your right after she kills you, and I am going to kill the man at the door after I kill the man behind you. That is what is about to happen. You can stop it by walking out of here. You have until I finish the count of 3. 1, Coulter reached for his gun. He never touched the grip. Louisa's first shot took him in the throat. Her second shot took the man to his right in the chest. Esther's first shot took the man behind Coulter in the forehead. Esther's second shot took the man at the door in the stomach, because the man at the door had already started to turn, and a head shot was no longer clean. The cantina was silent. Smoke hung in the air. The bartender behind the bar slowly took his hand off the shotgun. The twins holstered their pistols. Louisa put a silver dollar on the table for the dinner. They walked out past the bodies without looking down. Word of Piedra Blanca traveled faster than the twins did. By the time they reached the next town, the story had grown. Coulter's 4 men had become 6. The twins had become invincible. By the end of 1873, no white bounty hunter in the Southwest was willing to cross the Vance sisters for a bounty, even if he believed the bounty was his. It was simply not worth it. The twins, for their part, never spoke of Piedra Blanca. They did not talk about their kills. They did not keep account. They did not brag. They simply rode, and they collected, and they delivered, and they moved on. But the twins had a count, even if they never spoke it. The count was in Louisa's pocket, written in small, careful letters on a single folded piece of paper. It had been there since they left Rosewater Hall. It did not list the men they had killed in the course of business. It listed the men from Rosewater Hall's Silas Thorne, Percival Dunmore, Colonel Augustus Finch, and below those 3, 5 more names. Men who had been present the day their mother was taken. Men who had stood in the yard and let it happen. Overseers, a neighboring planter. The old house doctor who had examined Harriet and pronounced her fit for service with the regiment. 8 names. For 5 years, the twins did not go near any of them. They had made a decision early in their first year under Obadiah's teaching that they would not hunt their own targets until they had become the best hunters in the territory. They had promised Obadiah they would finish their training first. They had promised themselves they would never come at those men as amateurs. By the end of 1875, they were no longer amateurs. They were the deadliest bounty hunters in the West. It was time to go home.